it's time for our next speaker. So I will hand it over to Pratik, who's speaking about OpenAPI, aka Swagger. Over to you, Pratik.
So this is a quick talk, obviously, on OpenAPI. And I'm pretty sure that most of you are working in some sort of a project where APIs are kind of involved somehow. It's very hard to imagine otherwise. And I mean, if we are all like either developing APIs or consuming APIs or using APIs to integrate between two systems or between your front end, back end, and things like that. So I thought that this is a good chance to talk something about OpenAPI. And some of us might already know that in its previous name, which was Swagger. So just to recap, in a typical API lifecycle, what do we do? There are many other steps. I thought of like some of the important steps are like we need to design the API. So that's the interface or the contract for your API. Once it's designed, we need to develop or build our API. Not all of these steps are discrete steps. You might be doing design and development together, not as two separate steps. But in some sort of more public facing API, you might be doing the design to get some sort of approval or things like that. So you might be splitting that step. Once you develop the API, you need to test that API, document the API, because your API, everybody should love your API. It should be very easy to understand the interface. You should have examples, very easy to understand how to call your API, what are the responses, requests, things like that. And often what we do nowadays is we publish the API into some sort of a API gateway. It can be like AWS or Azure API gateway or APG or anything like that. And finally, if you are the consumer of the API, you obviously love to consume that API. So to me, OpenAPI or Swagger sort of binds all these things together in a very wholesome way. And at least in my company, we are sort of describing APIs using, we still call it Swagger. Nobody actually still uses OpenAPI, but that is what we should use the term is OpenAPI. And OpenAPI was developed by a company called SmartBR as Swagger some time back, and it was donated to a sort of a governance forum called OpenAPI Initiative, which sort of runs it in the open nowadays. And what they describe, the OpenAPI specification, I think the core thing is highlighted. It's a standard programming language agnostic interface description for REST APIs, which means that it is sort of at least an industry standard or open standard. It doesn't depend on the language you're using to build or consume the API. You can write an API in Python and consume in JavaScript, or write in Go and consume in C#. It doesn't matter. It's friendly for humans to read at and understand. So you should be able to just look at the API description and understand what the different endpoints are, what are the request response parameters, things like that. It should also be easy for computers or sort of applications to also use a description to maybe create like a client SDK, or to quickly test it or mock it and things like that. So that's why OpenAPI comes in. It's really, I mean, for those who are from the old times, we know that we had a standard called SOAP for more like web services kind of description. So this is very similar, but it's much more simpler. It's very friendly and readable. So I kind of like it. You can write it in both JSON and YAML. My gut feeling is that if you're writing the API first, you should use YAML, because it's much easier to write YAML as a human than to write JSON. It's less clutter. But if you generate the specification out of your code, then it might be JSON as a standard. So very quickly, what it looks like is there are a few sections to the structure. Now this is OpenAPI. Swagger was the older standard. I'm not describing it. I'm describing the new standard, which is OpenAPI 3.0. So you've got a bit of a metadata here, which is, I'll go through the sections. And then there's a section of servers, which is like pretty much your URL, the server URL where your API is hosted. Some sections around security, as in it can be some OAuth flow or API key or basic the security protocols or schemes that your API supports. The yellow part is the very important part. That's your endpoints. So these will be the various parts of your APIs, the parameters, the requests, responses, things like that. Tags are they're kind of a way to sort of group your APIs, paths, and endpoints. I haven't used external docs. I believe this is a link to an external URL where you can have more additional information. And finally, components. These are reusable sort of elements that can be used in other places. Example of this can be your response body. You might have multiple endpoints that returns the same response body. Instead of defining it individually within every endpoint, you might have defined it one place as a JSON schema and just reference it from there. Same thing can be for a parameter or a header, which you don't have to describe in every defined endpoint because they can be described at one place, reused by reference here. So without more going into this, let's go into actually see how an OpenAPI spec looks like. So I've got a sample API that I'm running. The actual JSON. The actual JSON looks like this. It's got a few areas, as I said, like info, server, paths, components, security. I use a tool called Swashbuckle in .NET that actually provides the UI to visualize these as well. And there can be other UIs. There are other documentation UIs that does the same similar thing. So here you can see that this is my info section, which sort of tells you the title of the API, version information, terms of service, contact, licensing, that kind of thing. Servers, you can have more like production, development, staging, the servers where your API is hosted. These are the endpoints for your API. So let's go into detail of one of them. Let's say that the tool. So the endpoints of the API are the path and the HTTP method, which sort of defines your endpoint. And then then other thing that it defines is like request IDs or headers or cookies or whatever you have that are sort of the input to the API. And what are the responses? So this will be like various response codes, HTTP response codes, and the response body. For in my example, I've given some examples. So this is how you can richly decorate your OpenAPI specification so that you can actually provide examples. So it's very easy for somebody new to come to your API and quickly understand, okay, so I kind of send an ID. So I've got examples of the ID here, and this is how I get back. And if you want to see the schema, so that's sort of coming from that component section where you can see, okay, this is what the schema is. So it's a to-do object, and it's got an ID, which is of type string, it's nullable, it's got example, the description. So you can very richly describe your API. It becomes very friendly, fun, and you really want your API to be loved by everyone so that everybody sort of uses your API. Going back to my slides again. So the metadata section, and there's an equivalent YAML as well. So actually, let's look at the YAML. The YAML will look like this. So this is the YAML equivalent of the JSON, and you can see that it's much more sort of friendly. And if you're doing API first, I probably suggest that do it in YAML rather than in JSON. I have generated this one using the Swashbuckle .NET library, but you can definitely write this by hand if you want, at least initially, and then sort of once you develop it, you might then auto-generate it out of the code. So we already looked for sections, so I'm not going to repeat them. What can you do with these things? So design, we got tools to help us in design. Some of the tools are, there's an extension for Visual Studio Code, and then there is a tool called Stoplight Studio and Swagger Editor. So I'll just quickly go through them. So with the extension, if you go to the extension, you will see the things coming up in this extension. You can add sort of more paths to here, or you can add a new path, or you can add more methods to the path and things like that. So the extension really helps if you don't want to type the YAML. There are better editors as well. Let's go quickly. So there's a tool, there's an editor called Stoplight Studio, which is a web-based editor, and you can download an offline version as well, which is very, very easy and friendly to use. And it also does some linting as well. The linting is also available in Visual Studio as an extension. There's a Swagger editor from the guys of, I think there's the Smart Beer who originally developed it. So it's very similar to Stoplight Studio. So you can use these tools to do that. Development. So in .NET, I use a library called Swashbuckle, where I sort of decorate my APIs with more details, and it also gets it out of the XML documentation as well. For example, the sample request comes from here, the parameters, the IDs, and things like that. So every programming language will have something that will generate this Swagger or the OpenAPI specs for you. Testing, I use a tool called Postman. A lot of you probably use this one. It's very easy to import this Swagger into Postman and create an API collection. So Postman will automatically do it for you. So how easy is to now test your API? You give the Swagger to somebody, make it public in your Git repo, and anybody can just download it and create a client for it. You can also mock it using Postman, so testing becomes much more easier. Documentation, Swashbuckle itself is a nice library for .NET. There's a JavaScript library called Redoc, which is, I think, some people say is a much better library to documentation. I was making it work it's got a Docker image with which you can do it, but somehow it's not working now, so I actually cannot show you. Don't know why, but it's very similar to this one. You'll get a friendly web page on documentation out of it. And publish. All the API management gateways like Azure, AWS, APG, they can also import a Swagger OpenAPI specification file and automatically create a publish an API for you. So it becomes very easy to publish your API. You can do it through CI/CD pipeline. That's what we do at the place I work. Consumption of APIs. This is probably the probably one thing that I don't do, but yeah, there are tools available to also create a client SDK for you, given the Swagger file. There is an OpenAPI CLI generator for various languages that you can use. In Visual Studio, there is a thing called connected services, so you can actually say add connected services, and I can delete this one. But I can give the YAML file, and it will generate a SDK for me. So this tool only works with the. So this will generate a sort of a probably not the best code, but it does its job. Okay. So you can see that OpenAPI sort of binds the full API lifecycle together. I find it very useful to at least document my API when we're in the initial stages working with, let's say, the developers, the business analysts, the tester, even the product owner, because it's so easy, they can also understand OpenAPI. I find it very friendly. And eventually what we do is that we generate the Swagger and publish it, in our case, in Azure API management. And hopefully you got some good things out of this one, and think about using OpenAPI in your API development project and initiatives. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Hey, virtual claps. We do have some time for questions if anyone has any. I do see more virtual claps coming in. Haven't seen any questions yet, but yeah, thank you for that that overview. I hadn't seen some of those tools before, so that's definitely some very useful stuff. Yeah, just some thanks and positivity flowing in on the chat if you're checking that out.